Today we're looking at a hand played by Linus Love, and it is almost certainly not played in a GTO way. Even if it is, there is something you can learn that you can use as an exploit for your games, which is going to be mid stakes and below. But let's just get right into it. Linus opens King 10 suited on the button, gets 3-bet by the big blind, and with this nice suited Broadway hand, we have an easy call. We see a flop, completely miss it. We have a couple backdoor straight draws, but nothing else. One overcard, of course. The big blind checks here, and here we choose to make a stab. So this is not too uncommon, I would say. We will look into the solver solution in a few seconds, but here we have usually a very mixed stabbing range, which includes all kinds of hands, overcards, some gut shots, some under pairs, top pairs, second pairs. All kinds of hands are usually mixing here, and King 10, I would bet, is betting sometimes just checking. So this is probably never a mistake, and in practice it might even work a little bit better. Not necessarily on these stakes, because players are usually more balanced than on lower stakes, but on mid stakes and below, usually players tend to c-bet too often on in 3-bet pots if they're 3-betting pre-flop, and so their checking range usually includes a lot of more medium to weak hands, which, even though usually they don't check fold more often than the solver would, it is likely the case that they are check calling a weaker range than they should. And so that is also a reason why on the turn we will see a good opportunity for us as the button to exploit them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Linus bets. We see a check call by rigged egg, rigged egg, rigged deck. And we see a 6 of hearts on the turn. Flush completes. A lot of hands here in our range as the button do improve. So even if we just had a hand like 6-7 suited here and bet the flop with a gut shot, now we at least made a pair. We still have a gut shot then, but a hand like 9-10, for example, has now a double gutter. Of course, we have hearts that we stab on the flop and now made a flush. And everything that was a pair is obviously still a pair on the turn. Button checks again, pretty standard. And now Linus chooses to bet once again. For half pot, size I think is pretty standard here. We are setting up a nice 75% river shove here, and half pot bet is not the easiest for the big blind to defend against. It's not like he can just check fold anything that is worse than top pair, but it's not like he has to continue any pair as well. But the second question we want to ask ourselves here is King 10 the best option for betting? In my opinion, in my estimation, I would probably say it's not, in GTO at least, just because I would guess that the solver wants to have at least some kind of equity. So single hearts, of course, make for very good bets. There won't be as many here in this formation, button versus big blind 3-bet. So it's not like we have just Jack 10 off here or even King Jack off. King Queen is, of course, a pair. Sometimes solver will call Ace King off, so that would make for a good bluff here, probably, if it includes a heart. Ace Jack maybe sometimes, but not too often. I would say it's not getting called too often pre-flop, being 4-bet some of the time and even folding a decent portion as well. So I would guess that the solver would take hands like 9-10 suited, maybe Jack 10 suited more often here on the turn, to choose as bluffs, because even though they are not, they don't have a flush draw, they still have some kind of equity that can win and even put in money against hands that would call on the river and are worse if they hit. So Jack 10, if it makes a straight, it can still get called by some sets, for example, or a 2-pair, or flushed blockers. However, this hand is almost dead equity. Of course, if we hit a king, we can check it down against ace queen or queen jack or whatever, but that is not too great of equity that we have here. So I would say this is probably not solver approved. However, in reality, we see that, what I've seen in my exploitative study that I made for GTO to exploit and have published in there, is that people in a big blind and a small blind as well, so out of position 3-betters, check fold too often on the turn if they check called the flop. So overall, queen high boards, they just check fold much more often than the solver would on the turn, and that is especially true for flush turns. So I can put up the numbers here. I have the stats right here. Check fold turn after check call flop. Population check folds 43% of the time. GTO would only check hold 38% of the time. And on flush turns, that number is even higher. So GTO would only check fold 36% of the time, and population folds 45% of the time on flush turns in this formation and in this node. So we will look into the solver whether king 10, whether that is enough to make king 10 a bet here, but it might very well be. So here you can definitely bet more often against the mid stakes and low stakes population if you're the button, and exploit their overfolds. We do see a call by the big blind, and now we do see another heart on the river. So once we are here, the thought is, of course, well, we have a non-hard hand here in the spot, which might not be the case too often, because just as just discussed, most turn bluffing hands will likely contain a heart. So we have to choose carefully from the hands that we brought from the turn to the river, to look for some that are still a bluff. And king 10 is maybe one of the few ones. At the same time, if we say that we would barrel every 9-10 suited on the turn, every jack 10 suited on the turn, maybe even some 6-5, 6-7 hands on the turn that are all not including a heart, and we bet all of them on the river here, then of course it can get very easy for us to overbluff. And in this case, Linus also goes for it and jams it in here. We will get to this hand, we will get back to the hand in a second, but let's quickly see what the solver has to say about the hand. So here, big blind would 3-bet. This is the button's calling range against the 3-bet. We see king 10 suited is of course in here. However, on the offsuited side, we don't see too many hands. So ace queen, king queen are of course a pair on the flop. Ace jack is actually not being folded that often here. So we do still have some combos and even some tiny amount of king jack off combos. How much you call those in practice is of course a different story and depends a lot on you and your opponent. But let's just say there's not too many offsuited hands here that don't have a pair on this flop and turn. Let's have a look at what would be the GTO play here. So we have a pot of 24.5 big blinds and 88 big blinds in stack depth. For the flop, we don't know what size the button bet or would bet because he just checked. For Linus, we know that he bet 40% pot. So let's just use that size only. For the turn size, let's just have a look at what size would be the optimal one if we only use one for flop and turn, and then readjust if it is not the size that Linus used actually in game. So here we have the flop. And solver would choose a 2/3 pot bet size on the flop for the button, for the big blind, and bet around 1/3 of our range or their range. So mostly top pairs and over pairs mostly. Sets would mostly check, and then we have a big checking range here with all these middling pairs and bottom pairs, and then some ace highs would bet, some king highs would bet, probably backdoor flush draws and direct flush draws. Yep, and the according blockers here with the offsuit region, and pretty much the same goes for, yeah, here it's mostly just direct flush draws and straight draws, so a lot of gut shots we have here. Right, that makes total sense. We do check, and now for imposition. As assumed, we can bet a lot of hands, but we also just mix a lot of the time. So here, King 10 is actually bet a little bit more often than it is checked, but both options are totally in the softest frequencies, and that pretty much goes for almost every hand here that we have in the button's shoes. So even those pocket pairs, mixed checking and betting, the only hand classes that clearly prefer betting are sets and some aces that we slow play here. Pre-flop, which is likely never happening in practice, I would say. Not sure if I've ever seen the button just call pre-flop against the big blind raise, but well, maybe I missed something. Yeah, every other hand class pretty much mixes almost 50-50. Right, so here, oh, okay, yeah, the bet size here would actually be a little bit lower, so only 25% pot is what the solver would go for if it chooses only one size. So let's have a look at what would be the size if we bet 40%. Would bet a little bit less often, I would guess. Yeah, almost 9 percentage points less often, but still same distribution basically. So all kinds of hands, mix bets and checks. Just a little bit more checking overall when we bet slightly bigger than the 25%, but still King 10 actually bets it slightly more often here, King 10 of clubs. Probably a little bit more polarized of a strategy, if that's what it is here. So if we bet bigger, we likely bet top pairs and better more often, and ace high and worse also more often, while checking these in the middle preferably more often. And against such a bet, we would see quite some check raises. So all of the overpairs check raise, sets slow play, top pairs check raise sometimes, 30% of the time. Flush draws check raise sometimes, backdoor flush draws as well. Some of the blockers, backdoor flush draws with one heart, and then yeah, some of those draws. So basically, those hands that would see bet a lot would also sometimes check raise and be the ones that check raise most often. But we also see sets check call, top pairs check call, under pairs check call, nines even start folding here without a heart. Interesting, probably not happening too much in practice, if at all. Same for these low pocket pairs. These basically fold purely, also interesting, if they don't have a heart. Whereas a hand like ace jack of diamonds can check call. Well, all right. Turn is the 6 of hearts. And we see pure checks here. For imposition, 40% would be the preferred bet size here. So not too far away from the 50% that Linus used. Probably not a difference in EV if the strategy is played correctly. So here we actually see that we bet a lot. So even in GTO, we actually see King 10 of clubs and every other King 10 as well bet 100% of the time. So I was completely off here. I would have guessed that this was not a bet here. However, the button's betting range is extremely high here, extremely aggressive betting. So basically any hand we have wants to bet at least for some frequency. Those that mostly check or almost check purely are these hands, so jacks through nines, whereas while nines also bet quite often if they have a heart. So second pairs, the higher ones, so yeah, I mean 10-8 and higher also check a lot. And then some of these complete, oh no, these are not complete air hands. These are actually the hands that have a gut shot. So these hands actually check more often. So again, I was off here. It seems like the solver likes to just capitalize on the equity these hands have, because they can also not only hit a gut shot, but also a pair and probably be good a lot of the time on the river. So these hands, oh, and they also block a lot of the big blinds check folding range probably. So when we look at what the, yeah, exactly, what the big blind would do against the bet, we can see that jacks, tens, nines, 10-9, jack 10, all of these hands that have a jack, a 9, and a 10 are a big part of the check folding range. So for that reason, we don't really want to bet these hands because we just block the check folding range. So that makes sense. I didn't think of that really. Anything else just can barrel off here pretty much. So even a hand like ace, I mean ace 5 has a gut shot, but ace 3 of spades is a pure airball with just an ace as an out. But still, GTO has us bet a lot of the time. So this is not actually, this doesn't have to be an exploit, but it is simply already a GTO strategy. And what this makes even more effective is that when we already bet that often in GTO, exploitatively betting range will just print money, because if we already bet this often in GTO, then we can bet even more often if our opponent overfolds here against the bet. And here the big blind's range probably doesn't even look like this. So in reality, they will likely check call a weaker range on the flop because they bet a little bit more often with some of their good hands. So I would guess they probably have less of these queen X hands here getting to the turn in this line. And therefore, that's one of the big reasons why they overfold against the turn barrel. Probably also check calling less often with hands that would be check calls here. What would be an example? Maybe ace king. Well, no, they don't fold ace king with a heart here. Ace 8 with a heart, they also don't fold. Sevens with a heart. No, these hands look quite natural. Maybe a hand like this, but this is also not too high of a frequency. These hands might fold in practice. But I think the bigger effect is that the check calling range on the flop is just weaker, so that the overfolds on the turn come from just a weaker range getting to the turn in the first place. So in reality here, we see a check call. And now let's have a look at what happens on the river. Now we actually see a donk betting strategy here for an all-in. So here the big blind would just donk shove his range basically. And that is apparently because 60% of their range are flushes. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because what hands on the turn do they check call with that are not flushes? Not too many, right? So here, wait, these, what is happening? Why are there no, oh no, why are there no top pairs in the range when they check call? That makes no sense. They do check call top pairs. Like, oh, top pair is an ace's top pair. Yeah, second pairs. Just a little brain fart here. So yeah, most of the hands that are not flushes come from queen x hands, so second pairs, not top pairs. And while some of those do not jam here, we do actually turn queen jack of spades and clubs into bluffs here, because while it might appear that the part of those hands that we have in our range is pretty big, check calling the turn, they make only 21% of our range here actually, and 60% are flushes. So here that includes pocket sevens, pocket nines, and a lot of the two card flushes here. And with such a big flush advantage here, it looks like just jamming is the better play. Third pairs can also be turned into bluffs purely, as are low pairs. So these suited connectors here that have a gut shot and a pair on the turn, check call there, and then are just turned into a bluff. And yeah, this is quite interesting. This is one of the difficult things to estimate, how much these hands make up in your range. So if I was in a spot, I'm not sure if I would have guessed right that second pairs, third pairs, and low pairs would make up only 35% of my range here, and that 60% would be flushes. So if you know that, then apparently you can just jam in your flushes here. And those hands that don't are mostly pairs, because they have still okay showdown value, I guess, if button doesn't decide to bluff off here. However, you can of course not only check king queen here and nothing else, but you have to balance it with some pocket queens. Queens is also interesting. I mean, this is a hand that in isolation really does not want to jam here, because we win against any two pair, any ace x hands that would check down in the button's shoes. And at the same time, I don't know how often we are going to get called by worse hands if we just jam here. In practice, that is. In GTO, probably some worse hands would have to call here, I guess. I'm not sure. But this hand is probably just a victim of our range strategy. So when every hand could play for its own hands EV, then I would guess this hand would just always check. But when we have so many flushes that want to jam here, and also some bluffs that have to balance our jamming, our value jamming range, then the sets are just in there and just have to jam for a good frequency as well. But now let's have a look quickly at what the button's calling range would have to look like. Okay, so at first glance, of course, every flush has to call here, even pocket sevens, but also every set has to call here as well. And well, if we know that, then pocket queens become much more reasonable as a jam here for the big blind, because yeah, these lower sets call, some two pairs call, and also most top pairs have to call here as well, which is probably of a function of the big blind just jamming a lot of the time here with any pair that is not a flush. So quite interesting. So quite loose of a play here. I think in reality you don't see that loose of a jamming range or that aggressive of a jamming range in the first place. And then also against the jam, you will likely not see people just call more than 80% of their ace-x hands here. I would definitely bet against that, which makes this spot probably a good spot to just bluff in the big blinds range. But let's go ahead and see what happens against the check, which is the line that we actually saw. King 10 is, first of all, not really jamming a lot, so only 7% here, which makes it probably not a high EV jam here. Let's have a look at the EV. So slightly minus EV. King 10, diamonds a little lower even. What are some better bluffs? So top pairs actually jam here sometimes. Well, are there a bluff? Probably some mergey action going on with these hands. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, exactly. So, well, not really mergey. We don't fold out better hands, but we do actually have to get called by some queen X here. So that makes ace X a value jam here. Also something that is probably not happening that much in practice. And then third pairs and low pairs would be the hands that the solver chooses as a bluff here. So anything that is 8x and 6x and 4x and any pocket pair pretty much jams 100% of the time here. So these are our most preferred bluff hands. These hands actually don't bluff that often, even though they are worse hands. And that is likely because the big blinds range getting to this node is very condensed. So it's not like showdown value has a big impact here. It's not like 8x beats a lot of hands that the big blind would check here, right? So the worst hands in the big blinds range are 6x hands here, and those are only 2 hands really, and then some tiny frequencies of 4 or 5. But more hands would be 8x themselves, and a lot of oh no, wait, these lower hands don't even check. So those hands that get to the river with as a check are all queen X or better. And if that is the case, then it doesn't matter whether we have third pair or low pair or king high or just 10 high, because all of these hands will lose against the big blind's queen X hands, which are the big blind's worst hands. And so it doesn't matter whether we have showdown, more or less showdown value here, because all of these hands have 0 showdown value against any hand in the big blind's range that gets to this node. And so we don't choose our bluffs because of showdown value, but because of blockers. And here, these pair hands unblock more of the big blind's folds than these king high and jack and 10 high hands block. So these hands, king high and jack high and 10 high, they block more of the big blind's check folds, because these queen X hands have these high cards as kickers, and we don't want to block these hands. We want to unblock these hands, and therefore these pair hands are better bluffs in this spot. Hope that makes sense. It is logical if you think about it, but of course you have to think about all of this during the hand. And of course you don't really, when you play these hands, you don't really think about every step by step for the first time, but you have these dynamics, these mechanics, you have seen them hundreds of times already, so it comes it hopefully comes naturally for you, and you just think of which hands are better bluffs on the spot. But then again, Linus chooses this hand as a bluff here and not... Well, we don't know if he chooses these as well. Maybe he chooses both of them as bluffs. Maybe he thinks he can actually overbluff here because if, let's say, the big blind checked a few of these flushes too little, so he doesn't check these flushes often enough, but only these pair hands, for example, then he wouldn't be able to check call often enough. And then overbluffing in Linus's shoes would make sense. But all of that is individual dynamics that can go either way. For GTO, we see that King 10 is not the best bluff. It also doesn't, it's also not a huge punt. But clearly these low pair hands are better bluffs here. Now, finally, let's have a look at what happened here. Linus jammed and we see rig deck calls, which already means Linus loses the hand, of course, and he just has ace queen with the queen of hearts. So not a difficult call for him. We see that he shouldn't actually have this hand here because for the solver, first of all, any flush or most of them would be a jam here, but even then ace queen is not even in the range here. Let's have a look at what it would do here. So wouldn't even be, wait, where is it? Here. Wouldn't even be in the turn range. Would it check raise the flop? Yes, it would basically 100% of the time check raise the flop already and then not be in the range. But then again, other combos, even with a heart, would check call here. But the queen of hearts is actually a pure check raise here on the flop already. That just goes to show that ranges will look differently in reality than in GTO. But still, the concepts are always interesting to look at, and we can learn a lot from those if you then apply them to your games and to ranges that might look a little bit differently in reality, then you are on the best way. Well, that should be it for today. I'm happy you made it this far, and I'll see you in the next video.